All right, well, I think we should raise a glass to David and thank him for bringing us this amazing story from down south. How about that? Cheers. So let's get right into it. We heard from you, David. You paint a picture that's both pretty scary. Was anybody scared about what the future holds if we look at the US, but also filled with a lot of bright spots and hope. So I'm going to turn to you, Deena, and ask, what are some of the things that jumped out for you from what David had to say?
Well, I'm sure for many of us in this room, a lot of it sounded familiar, right? I think a lot of us have been having these conversations and have been seeing all of these things take place in our workplaces. We've seen our contracts being attacked. We've seen our wages never going up. We've seen our bills going up, but not having enough to pay our bills. And I think we've seen things get really tough. And it's been pretty depressing, right? In terms of the stuff that's been happening. And so I think that for us, I mean, I know with the Fight for 15 and Fairness and with the Workers' Action Center, we've been having conversations with many of the union members in this room and with other unions about what the hell are we going to do about this. And I think that part of the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign has been that response. And I think that we have been trying to figure out how to explore things like sectoral bargaining, how to deal with the kinds of workplaces that we have. I mean, when the largest growth industry is service sector jobs, so many of our kids, so many of our families are in those jobs and are working at minimum wage, and they ain't paying the bills, that's for sure, right? And so we know that, and so it's been about how do we figure out how to deal with these crappy conditions that we're dealing with in a long-term way so that we can actually build power to not only get this legislation that we need, which is in Bill 148, but really, that's just the beginning, right? It's about, yes, it's about building the strength on the ground for the fights to come, which include your bargaining in 2019, right? And we've got to kick some ass in that bargaining. So I think that part of, I think in some ways, like we've been totally grappling with this, and I think there's a lot of resonance.
That's great, and obviously you have a cheering section. Say, raise your cheer again, guys. And actually, put up your hand if you're a community member that's been invited today by QP Local 79 to be part of this gala. All right? And that is an amazing thing. So we're in a special space here right now where we have a union local of city workers who, thank you, you deliver the services that the city needs. Amazing. Yes. Opening up a space and inviting community in, and I think that I wanted to go back to this question of how. How do we actually deliver on those wins? And I'll start with you, David. Community labor, community union partnerships, like where are they succeeding and how do they succeed? And then I'm going to ask you the same thing.
So I want to come at this two different ways. First of all, when you look at all of the success, I mean, as I said, in general, U.S. workers have been losing more than they've been winning for a generation. But when you look at the counter examples, where some innovative policy gets passed or some group of workers that is low wage and powerless ends up breaking through and succeeding, it is almost always because those campaigns have an element that is of a political and community nature and not just of traditional industrial organizing. We could never have won the breakthrough home care campaign was the Los Angeles campaign in 1999. It absolutely depended on alliances within the senior citizens community, the community of activists of people with disabilities, and especially, I would say, the African-American clergy and some of the more progressive elements within the Catholic Church, as well as within kind of the, sort of progressive democratic political circles. So you could go to every living wage campaign, every really successful public sector contract campaign. I mean, the dirty little secret is that the power of mass industrial strikes has long since faded in the United States. So what often powers low-wage workers to be able to win anything is the political and community strength they build. I think that's it's almost categorically correct We couldn't find many examples of winning campaigns that didn't involve community elements going back over the last generation. I think that the sort of flip side of that, though, the sort of union community, some evolution is going to have to take place. Because outside of a handful of cities and a handful of industries, the traditional unions that could do things like subsidize community and political alliances are getting smaller and weaker. And because of a US Supreme Court decision we expect this coming spring, we think we're going to lose a couple million more union members in a single day. And so ultimately, I would say unions can't imagine that they alone have all the solutions, and we're going to have to increasingly turn outward and be in partnerships, sometimes uncomfortable ones, in order to discover a path to creating the next generation of powerful, scalable, and revenue-sustainable organizations.
And so, thanks. So for Deena, in the Canadian context and the work you've been doing on the ground, how has that looked for you? Have there, like, in terms of community working with labor, alongside labor, how does it give us some examples of where you think it's really a success that we need to scale up, we need to do more of?
I've been in Canada for about 30 years, and I think when I think about my family and coming into this country, I think for many people in this room, this could be similar. Even though we've been here for 30 years, none of my family's ever been in a union, right? My dad was a car mechanic in England and came to Canada, but wasn't accepted as a car mechanic because he didn't have Canadian experience. My mum worked in many different companies as an office worker, and those companies either closed down, moved to the United States, the work was privatized. My brother has worked through temp agencies for most of his life. And so when you have massive sectors of the labor market that have no experience and will never be in a union, how do you build those connections with unions? And how do you build that when, and I think that there's many ways that we can do that, and I think we've been seeing that. We've been seeing that over the past 25 years in anti-racist work, right? Because frankly, a white supremacist doesn't give a shit whether you're in a union or not when they see you on the street. What they see is the color of your skin, right? That's what they see. And so there are many ways in which we come together in our community that I think we need to understand how to do more of. There are incredible movements on the ground since, I moved here in '87, but since I moved here, there's been a lot of anti-racist work that's been happening in this city, where we've seen union members and non-union members working hand in hand because of the color of our skin, right? And because we had no choice. There is part of the reason why we started the Workers' Action Center about 17 years ago was understanding that if your connection to your workplace is through your union membership, what happens when you lose that job? What happens when you get laid off? It doesn't mean that you don't give a shit about what's happening to the labor movement anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't care about working conditions. It just means you've lost your membership in a union. But people still want to be part of the labor movement, even if they're not part of a union. And so part of the Workers' Center has been about trying to build a connection and a movement with workers who are unemployed, who are on social assistance, who are undocumented, who are like my parents, right? Who actually really, we have a lot of issues, my family does, let me tell you. They don't necessarily agree with a lot of things I've done in my life, but the one thing that they agree with and they support me on is workers' rights struggles, right? Because they know what it's like. They know what it's like to not be able to pay their bills and to be on unemployment insurance and to be laid off and to deal with the kind of lack of respect that we see in the workplace because of the color of your skin, right? And to not have the experience and who you are as a person be actually recognized and be treated that way in the workplace. And so I think that if we understand who is in this room and who we are and what our families have been facing, whether we've always been in this country, whether we've been here for a couple of generations, or if we just came here last year, then that is how we fundamentally understand how to build community and union coalitions. Because it really is about building class consciousness, right? It's about understanding that people give a damn about economics, but it also means about understanding how race plays a factor, how if you're a woman, how that plays a factor, what your status is if you're on immigration papers. Because we know people get routinely rounded up by the vans and they go to different malls and they're picking people up, right? And so, you know, we know that's happening in our communities, and when we understand how to build that linkage and how to work together on those issues, that is how we build the kinds of incredibly strong union and non-union connections that are going to really build a strong movement in this country.
So picking up on something that you mentioned there, you know, in Canada and in Toronto especially, we like to think that we're so progressive. We look at the United States and there's Trump, but of course we had Rob Ford first. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was this rise of right-wing populism, you know, like, because there are white supremacists marching at Toronto City Hall just as much as they are marching in the United States. And they don't like the people in this room, right? As much as they're also anti-union, they don't like to have the conversation where we talk about a good job, where we talk about facing the climate crisis, where we talk about infrastructure and development, helping people and being a platform for good things. Why is it so important to have this conversation about the role of the labor movement and about the labor movement adapting for new realities and making those community connections, especially right now when you see a dude dressed up as a Nazi on your street?
Wow. Okay. So.
Small question.
So here's my basic analysis of this, is that there are, you know, not all populism is bad. There is actually a qualitative difference between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Right-wing populism has as its fundamental thesis that the elites are taking from you, the majority, and giving what rightfully belongs to you to some other group of people who are competing with you and that have a different set of interests than you. And so they blame the elites, but they don't blame the elites because the elites are enriching and empowering themselves. They blame the elites because the elites are rewarding unjustly earned benefits on some other group of people who tend to be of a different race or religion or gender or background or whatever, nationality, etc. Left-wing populism actually just believes that the elites are taking all the power and money for themselves because they want all the power and money. But both types of populism have in common that they believe the elites are up to no good and it's not serving the majority. Right-wing populism grows where left-wing populism doesn't exist. So if progressive political parties and unions and community organizations are afraid of articulating a squarely oppositional position vis-a-vis neoliberalism and the upwards redistribution of wealth, we tempt the growth of right-wing populism. And I think that's what you're seeing. That's why you see left-wing populism grow in Southern Europe right now, where they're mainly mad at central bankers for bankrupting their countries, and right-wing populism growing in Northern Europe. So I think that ultimately, I mean, these things are not simple, and I certainly am not a student of every anti-fascist and anti-right movement in world history, but I would say from our movement's perspective, let's start by offering a crisp, clear, compelling left populist vision where the people, both those who were left out to begin with and those who have been left behind in the new economy, form a coalition that's unstoppable against the people who are actually the problem for both of us.
Thank you. What about you, Deena?
So I think that this is a really hard conversation for a lot of people on the left. And I totally agree with what David is saying. But I also think there's another part of this. Because a lot of us sort of were looking at Rob Ford and Doug Ford, and remember when we said, oh, he's never going to get elected? Right? Do you remember that? And he did. And Doug Ford is wanting to run. And I think we need to kind of understand a little bit more about that. Because, you know, I work with some folks from Rob Ford's old community, and when he passed away, and these are people that are living in deep poverty and who are from the Somali community, and when I spoke to an organizer who I work with on the 15 and Fairness campaign, he said to me, you know, I'm going to go to his funeral, and because Rob Ford's my friend. And when I spoke to him, and you know, because I'm doing some work in that community, and I think the thing is that people didn't feel invisible, right? And everyone talks about the fact that Rob Ford used to pick up the phone, and if you had a problem, you just called him. And the thing is that sometimes we can become very complacent in our left ideology and the way that we work in communities. And we think that if we just have the right message, that somehow people on the ground are going to totally relate to it. And it doesn't happen that way. The way people understand and how they get involved in politics and how they'll support you in your campaign is if you have a relationship with them. If they know you, if they know that you see them and that you're not ignoring them until the election. And we have a problem because what we do is we do not do on-the-ground organizing on an ongoing basis. We contact people 2 months before an election. We contact them when we need their vote. And we ignore them otherwise, right? And we need to change our approach, because if we are actually going to really deal with the kind of fascist organizing that we're seeing and the white supremacists that are coming out of their little holes, they've always been there. And if we're going to actually understand how to get rid of politicians who believe in privatization and contracting out, and if we're going to get rid of that philosophy out there where people are resentful because union members have pensions and have paid sick days and actually have decent collective agreements, because there's a lot of resentfulness out there, and you know it, right? Because we don't get to see that support. So to me, I think the biggest question here is, how are we doing our organizing on the ground? How are we building relationships with communities that have been marginalized way too long, that have been in precarious work way too long, that will never be in a union job, that will never be in a public sector job, that will always be discriminated because of who they look and where they live? And if we don't understand that, and we don't put the kinds of resources in a deep and ongoing way to build those relationships on the ground that are grounding our communities and our unions together, we're going to be having this conversation year after year after year after year, okay?
And on that note, and on some of the successes that you've both talked about, we have the basis to form relationships. People, there's an election in a year. I'll see you on the doorstep, because I'll be knocking on doors with you.
Let's start now. Let's start now.